You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour on the Vets on Media Network.
Good morning, Arizona, and welcome to our listeners from around the globe. My name is Joe Brett, along with
David Lucier,
and we're at the tag team here, and this is the Veterans Heritage Hour. David, good morning.
how are you, Joe?
I'm doing great. We have a very special guest today, and this will be like going back to grad school. We have a truly wonderful storyteller and historian. And before we introduce him, David, I think we got some unfinished business from our last show. We were talking about PTSD. There's a study being conducted at Wake Forest University for the Special Operations Command.
Yeah, they got a grant through the Special Operations Command.
And so when we left it last time, I think we're going to post something up on our Facebook page or on our website or both. We're encouraging people to volunteer to go have this study done to prove the efficacy of brain optimization as one of the treatments for PTS. And many have maybe you can shed light on this, David, because people think that this PTS is to get you back into civilian life and to kind of moderate your behavior and tame you down so you'd be more compliant. But you have another take on this. The real reason for this study, David, why don't you tell our listeners about that?
Well, thanks, Joe. Number one, it goes to a couple of things that the military is interested in. And we've got a lot of operators out there who are just being used up at a huge rate, fast rate. It's the operational tempo, as they say, is just fast and furious. It's just like nothing we've ever seen before. Back when I was in Afghanistan in 2008, we had some special operators there who had been deployed 12, 13 times. That was in 2008. And so if you look at the military and their perspective and, the 50,000 foot level, you're talking about an organization that's really interested in two basic things. They want a high level of efficacy when it comes to killing people and, reaching the objective, but they also want a high level of survivability. And so using these operators at the pace that they're doing, they're going through a lot of them. And so what this does is this really does help put these operators who we've got millions of dollars invested in and who are really the tip of the spear in this, war against terrorism and our global commitment. It helps get them back in the field, back in the fight at a higher level of efficacy so that they're better when they go back as opposed to slowly wearing down. So that's hugely important. I want to mention about the study, it's what they call non-invasive. So you're not going to be, poked and probed and any of that kind of thing. So it's real easy. They put you in a nice chair. You're relaxed. They put a couple of little sensors on you, and you basically sit in a chair. This study covers all the costs. So it's transportation, it's room and board, and takes care of all the analysis and going through the actual process. I think, and I think you'll agree with me, Joe, this technology and this therapy could be a real game changer.
I think you're right. And you and I went through the training just so we could and knowing that if we talked about it, it wasn't going to hurt anybody. And
right.
Hopefully it was going to help people. And we found out that there's some help there. So we're encouraging people to look at our website, look at our Facebook. We're going to have information up. It's at Wake Forest University. It's all free. Treat yourself. And I might put a little sneaky word in here to the Green Berets, because one Navy SEAL is leading the way, and we're looking for the Green Berets to step up.
Absolutely. And of course, at Wake Forest, it's right in the middle of Special Forces country.
Yeah. So man up for everybody. And once we prove this, it's not so you can, go join a Cub Scout pack when you get out. It's so you can go back in and after this treatment, you can go back to work. And if your work happens to be a special operator, special forces operator, this is what it's for. And just think what it would do for you if this works. You could go back, you could get back into civilian life and pick up sort of where you left off.
Right. And these are operators that are all at the top of their game. We're
Yeah.
talking tier 1 operators getting better.
And so if it works for them, think of what it could do for the rest of us. So with that said, why don't you introduce our guest that morning, David?
Well, this morning, thanks, Joe. This morning, we've got Dr. Kyle Longley, and I'm going to reach across and read a little bit about him, and then we'll let him take it from there. But just as a way of introduction, Kyle Longley is the Snell Family Dean's Distinguished Professor in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies and the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. Go Devils. And an affiliate in the School of Transporter Studies, the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and Center for Law and Global Affairs in the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. He's also a faculty associate at the Strauss Center of the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. Beyond all of that, he's found time to write several books, 2 of which we're going to be talking about today, Grunts, and the Morenci Marines. So, and he's also currently working on several books, In Harm's Way, A Military History of the United States, and The Death of LBJ, Days in the Life of a President. So, Kyle is a prize-winning teacher with work at undergraduate and graduate levels. He's routinely received recognition. It goes back 12, 15 years, as a matter of fact. He's also been active in professional organizations, such as the American Historical Association, Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, the Organization of American Historians. Well, I think you're getting the idea here. Right. We're really, really excited about having Kyle here with us, and we just want to say welcome to the show, and we'll let you take it from here, Kyle.
Okay. Well, thank you, David and Joe, for the invitation.
You're the best.
This was a great opportunity to come out and talk about something that is extremely important, something that I've focused on in the last decade.
Sure.
Primarily the Vietnam War. So it's a great opportunity. So I'll let you start by where would you like me to go?
Well, I ought to point out he's a West Texas guy. So in addition to all those academic achievements, he's a pretty good windmill man. I think they would say
West
that.
Texas football player.
West Texas football player. So why don't you take us back to 1919, as you suggested? Let's start this Vietnam War off where it began.
That is a great question. The Vietnam War, where does the United States involvement come? And yesterday I was teaching a class on both of my U.S. history survey and also to a special group within the community. And I talked about how Nguyen Ac Quoc, a Vietnamese nationalist, shows up at Versailles hoping to meet President Wilson to talk about President Wilson's 14 points, especially the concept of self-determination. But, unfortunately for him, he spends his last money on his tuxedo so he can go out and meet the president.
So why don't you tell us who that fellow is?
Yeah, Nguyen Ac Quoc later becomes, in 1941, Ho Chi Minh.
Yes.
And so this young Vietnamese then turns, once the president refuses to meet with him, he turns to the other major revolutionary power of the time, of course, the Soviet Union. And we know how it all plays out from 1919 to 1945. The United States is not actively involved as it's French Indochina. But in 1945, we do see OSS members parachuted into North Vietnam and into Vietnam to try to help with down U.S. violence. And the first people that they make connections with, of course, are the Viet Minh, who are led by a Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh. So when Ho declares independence in Hanoi in August 1945, standing alongside him are members of the DEER team, the OSS group, standing on the platform with him as P-38s fly overhead, American P-38s.
Sure.
And Ho declares independence from France. And unfortunately, in this case, for the United States, we get drawn in on the side of the French, who reintroduce themselves into Vietnam and into Indochina in 1945.
No. That was an Eisenhower initiative, right? With the Dulles boys involved?
Well, it was more the Truman in the early stages. Actually, we wonder in this case, if FDR had lived, how it might have been different.
Sure.
But in this case, the Truman administration is very much tied to the idea that Ho is a puppet of the Soviet Union. And as the Cold War heats up, especially in 1946, you see the United States siding with the French. And what we know is from 1946 to 1954, the French fight a war against the Viet Minh. And this is not the North exclusive. This is a loose confederation of all different types of groups, including the Communist Party, ICP, which had folded itself into the Viet Minh in 1941. So what we see is the United States drawing in to the point in 1954, we're paying 3/4 of the cost of the French War.
And the U.S. is paying for that.
Yes. We're providing major amounts of arms, and we know how it all ends up. Dien Bien Phu, in May of 1945, they surrender after being surrounded and making a gross strategic miscalculation.
Hell in a very small place.
Hell in a very small place, to borrow Bernard Paul's characterization.
Yes.
And so what we see is the United States then try to replace the French. And so we see a demilitarized area at the 17th parallel divided, and this is where you get the South and the North. Elections are supposed to be held in 1956, but we opposed, and this is where the Dulles boys get involved. And you'll have a great quote by Walt Rostow, the former, future NSC advisor, who said, in 1956, Ho Chi Minh couldn't have been elected dog catcher in Vietnam. I think most of us would disagree with that appraisal, but we go ahead and support a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem. And Zim will be the person who we will support from 1954 to 1963 when he is assassinated. But we gradually get pulled more and more in. Special forces get pulled in to be advisors. And by the time the Kennedy administration leaves and Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, we have over 16,000 military advisors in South Vietnam.
Now, he was changing his mind, wasn't he, about bringing in, they said there was this NSC order that he signed. He was not going to commit ground forces.
Well, that was the argument.
Yeah.
But with the 64 election, I'm not sure he would have been able to follow up with that, especially once the hardliner Barry Goldwater won. There wasn't, and always within the Democratic Party was this idea of we don't want to be the party again that loses, and they've been accused of losing China in 1949. So they were very cognizant of that, and I think the election would have changed the dynamic. There's great debates over whether Kennedy would have escalated in the way that Johnson did. Personally, I fall to the side. I don't think it would have been dramatically different, given that basically Johnson inherited most of Kennedy's advisors, and they pushed, especially McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, and others, Rostow, pushed for a much harder line, which ultimately led to the introduction of massive amounts of American troops, especially after June of 1965.
So we're at this war. We start off, and David and I, this is our war. And so historically, the 60s start off with we're increasing the troops' strength in Vietnam.
Right.
And there's more and more protests now coming out of why we're doing this and the efficacy of our bombing. And the reports probably are coming out from some of our journalists who are there saying this is, we're not fighting a counterinsurgency. We're actually bombing civilians in all of our efforts to get the Viet Cong. So the war starts to go wrong almost immediately, does it not?
Well, it was, I'll give you an example. In 1961, in the Senate executive meetings of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a Tennessee senator goes, we're really heading down a slippery slope here. A guy named Albert Gore, senator who became an anti-war. He had gone as early as 1959 and said, this is a major catastrophe in the making, and we need to find a way to extricate ourselves as soon as possible. Hopefully, maybe seek a accommodation like what we'd seen in relation to Laos in 1961 and 1962, neutralization of the area. But many people just kept pushing. And again, there's a great quote in Philip Caputo's book about, we landed and we were ready to go and we didn't think we could be defeated. Or there was another journalist that made a comment. He says, he was on the USS Ranger aircraft carrier, and he says, all we got to do is show this to the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese and they'll surrender.
Wow.
And that's 1965. So we know at that point, we do start to see the protests start to rise. And a lot of people are questioning very early, including people like George Kennan, who said this was not the director or the architect of the containment policy, who says this is not a fundamental part of our national security interests. And we're being drawn and we're going to be handicapped by this. We see someone like J. William Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, hold hearings in 1966 and start to question the Johnson administration's plans. And on the other side, on the right side, you see people saying, well, why aren't you doing more faster? And, President Johnson has a great quote, two great quotes that I love of Johnson's. One was, he talks about, he knew this was going to be difficult. He just said he felt like a big old catfish in a Texas pond, seeing the worm on the end of the hook and just not being able to resist it.
Wow.
But in relation to the right, Johnson's greatest fear was igniting World War III over Vietnam. He always told the story and said, my greatest fear is some pilot from Johnson City, Texas is going to drop a bomb down a smokestack of a Russian trawler in Haiphong. And on that trawler will be the Russian ambassador, and he will ignite World War III. So you've got a lot of, criticism coming from a variety of different ways.
Wow. And so the draft starts along what time? When did that start? 63 or so?
Well, the draft actually had been in place since 1947.
Uh-huh.
But it escalated in terms of its numbers that were required. And so we see, especially through 65, 66, the majority of people who are in Vietnam are volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
That or they're draft induced. They volunteered to hopefully avoid certain types of duty, or they were searching for, opportunities to serve. We see a large number out of Germany, for example, volunteering to go to Vietnam because this was a way to win a CIB. They were bored in Germany. They wanted to be where the combat was. It's not really till 66, 67 that you start to see larger numbers of draftees. 68, 69, much larger numbers. So it evolved over time.
So in 67 or so, this is when there's riots in the streets in the United States. I mean, the Martin Luther King starts speaking out against the war. And
Right.
there's a lot of, and the students start, University of Wisconsin, and those
Right.
students starting to rebel. There was a lot of action by that. And those people, I'm surprised, they knew a lot. I mean, they were not just protesting to protest. They had some facts backing them
Right.
up. They were motivated by information. It wasn't just a visceral reaction. They knew things that the rest of us were not, either didn't know or were not told about,
Right.
or kind of withheld from us.
Well, I think keeping in mind the anti-war movement in our perception, of, say, when I'm teaching students, typically is one of, it's all a bunch of long-haired hippies. Well, we know that's not the case. We know there were mothers, Benjamin Spock, Dr.
Right.
Spock,
Yeah.
Martin Luther King.
The Berrigan brothers.
Yeah, the Berrigan brothers, Catholic priests,
Yeah.
J. William Fulbright, who was conservative on all levels, a racist in many areas. So it's a very heterogeneous group. And many of them were very well informed, like the Fulbright and Gore and, Frank Church and others that started, Eugene McCarthy, that started questioning the war, and even eventually Robert Kennedy.
Right.
So you see this evolve. So they were well informed. Now, some of it, many people would characterize as false propaganda. And I mean, one of the things that hurt the anti-war movement was when they start flying NVA or VC flags, and they would be perceived as traitors. But again, that's only looking at a very small group.
When we come back, we're going to take a short break here, but we'll come back. We'll get into the Gulf of Tonkin, and then we'll get into the Darwin theory of how people became grunts. This is one of your wonderful books here. We'll get into that. But you're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour. We'll be back after a short break.
Would you like to own a thriving business and help employ local veterans? The Vetraplex Handyman Construction and Landscape business is the opportunity you've been waiting for. The Vetraplex is your gateway to an affordable startup business with 0% financing for qualifying owners. By owning a Vetraplex franchise, you will be hiring veterans, providing them both income and opportunity, while at the same time providing your customers a way to say, thank you for your service to our nation's veterans. For more information, visit vetraplex.org. Again, that's vetraplex.org, or call 928-284-2022.
Breaker 19. How about that bandit? You got them ears on, son?
Have you ever wanted to be a truck driver? If so, pay attention. If not, pay attention anyway. Southwest Truck Driver Training offers everything you need to get started. You can get hired before you begin training. They've got GI Bill approved training facilities, day, night, or weekend programs to fit your busy schedule. And if you have any questions, no sweat. They've got veteran supportive campuses with veterans on staff to serve you. And on top of that, they have lifetime job placement assistance. Put the pedal to the metal. Call Southwest Truck Driver Training today.
Everyone's going to need an attorney at some point in their life. I'm no different. Hey everyone, it's James from Vets On. Whether it was my last will and testament before deployment or my ongoing custody battle for my children during my divorce, I needed help, so I lawyered up. If you need help, I urge you to contact Capstrom Law Firm. Capstrom Law Firm in Springfield, Missouri services clients throughout the state in criminal law, personal injury, and family law. With over 13 years practicing law, Tom Capstrom understands both law and court procedures and how stressful they can be. Let Tom Capstrom Law Firm and his dedicated staff take the stress and worry out of a difficult situation by calling him today. We feel so strong about the work that Tom and his staff are doing that he'll be a monthly guest on the show. Tom is a veteran and a listener, for God's sake, so you know the guy is solid and will fight for you. Give Tom a call today by calling 417-864-0552 or email Tom at capstromlaw.com. And don't forget to tell him that Vets On sent you.
The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertising.
If you or someone you know is looking for a new job or career, you need to visit the pros. National Career Fairs at ncfairs.com. National Career Fairs hosts over 300 career fairs a year nationwide. The events are free and give you the perfect chance to meet some of the top employers in your area face-to-face. To find the nearest career fair to you, visit ncfairs.com. Again, that's ncfairs.com. What are you waiting for?
You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour on the Vets On Media Network.
Welcome back to the Veterans Heritage Hour. Our guest today is Kyle Longley, professor at ASU. Dr. Longley, can you get us back into the Vietnam War is where it all started to go wrong for America? And let's start with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Why did Johnson need that?
Well, Johnson needed it. Well, again, I go back to that big juicy worm on the end of he was torn. I mean, a lot of people, I think it's much more complex than what a lot of times it's portrayed, that Johnson was a warmonger actively seeking the war. I think, he always talked about how he lost the war that he really wanted to win, and that was the war on poverty.
The Great Society.
Yeah, that, as he sometimes said, and please forgive my profanity, but that bitch of a war cost me the woman that I truly loved.
Yeah.
And so, but what he fell into, I think, was in August of 1964, he's facing a hardliner in Barry Goldwater, and he's afraid again of being accused of losing Vietnam. And suddenly here comes this Gulf of Tonkin incident. And we know for the first firing on the U.S. ship did occur. Mm-hmm. It's the second one when the
on the Turner Joy.
Yeah, on the Turner Joy, that is much more skeptical. But they were, as George Herring, a distinguished historian of the Vietnam War, says, they were looking for a reason to.
Johnston was looking for
Johnson, McNamara, that whole group, and the military, the JCS itself. Wow. H.R. McMaster's wonderful book called Dereliction of Duty looks directly at the JCS and its responsibility. So it's multi-leveled. It's not just Johnson, but it does serve Johnson's political fortunes quite well, because by striking the North Vietnamese and focusing on the North Vietnamese, it helps his election.
Sure.
And we know he was probably going to sweep it anyway, but it accelerated the process.
So then we get into grunts. We get into, tell us about the draft and all the machinations involved with who got drafted and where they served and how to avoid it and all of that. You have this down pretty well.
Well, I think the second chapter in my book, Grunts, The American Combat Soldier in Vietnam, really looks at this issue.
I love that chapter.
It really looks at the draft. And, it's not just the draft, it's the draft induced is another element of it. People who knew they were going to be drafted, so they tried to make a choice to determine where they wanted to go. And so what we see in these inequities that are created, one is you can use college as a deferment. Deferments were very liberal in certain areas. In certain areas you could be a farmer, and that was considered part of the national needs. And so you could be given a deferment. Groups would use religious reasons, mission trips, whatever it may be.
Sure.
So a lot of it fell on the working class and the lower middle class, the draft, because they didn't have the knowledge of how to game the system. I hate to characterize it to that, but it was the reality of it.
Sure.
And so you see people using deferments. My favorite deferment is the NFL quarterback for the Buffalo Bills who got a deferment for a medical problem with his knee.
Jack Kemp?
Yeah, Jack Kemp, who continued to play in the NFL. So he could play in the NFL, but he couldn't go serve in the military.
Sure.
There's a whole set of groups that we could, cyst on the posterior, got one guy out, and I won't name him, but he was an interesting guy in his own right. But, there were ways to get around the draft. But many Americans, young men, they saw this as their responsibility. They may not have wanted to do it, but they went and did it anyway.
Sure.
And that's what I think is extremely important. But, the way the draft boards were set up could also discriminate against you. For example, the head of the largest draft board in Louisiana was the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. So guess who got caught in those traps? It was predominantly African Americans. So he purposely put them in harm's way. So there are many things that I do discuss in the inequities that existed. But again, primarily a working class, lower middle class war, especially when you look at the frontline infantry, the ones that were the grunts out on the front lines.
And you call that Darwinism because it took the people who didn't have any other recourse wound up on the front lines.
Well, oftentimes.
Yeah.
And again, I made the point in the break, African Americans suffered significant casualties, especially early on in the war, because many of them had joined the military as a way to escape their economic poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And they typically wanted more money, so they would join airborne. They joined groups that would guarantee them more opportunities, but also guarantee them more opportunities to be on the front
That
lines.
$55 a month in jump pay was quite attractive.
It was quite attractive, especially for someone who's coming out of the South. And
it would
extreme
increase
poverty.
your monthly pay by 50%.
Yeah.
I was one of them.
Yeah.
I mean,
You're not
go
black.
from
You don't look
you go
black.
you go from
I know that
$100
about
to
you.
$155. That's a substantial gain.
Yeah, but I mean, and that was one of the reasons. But again, the U.S. military and especially the U.S. Army had to make some conscious efforts as the war went on, because the casualty rates for African Americans in the early stages were disproportionate to their numbers.
Well, those airborne units were just taking a beating. I was going through airborne infantry
Yeah.
training the summer of '67. I'd already hadn't quite gotten to jump school, and while we were going through that training at Fort Gordon through that summer, I mean, the headlines were just atrocious. I mean, the 173rd they were losing hundreds of people a week.
Right.
They were losing 100 people in one ambush. The 101st was just it was just all over. It was, and so all those units were frontline. Right out there, they were the tip of the spear in that
So,
war.
and also during that war, though, I was fortunate to serve with a colonel by the name of Roscoe Cartwright, an African American colonel, and so there was as much as there was a way for Black Afro Americans to rise up in rank, and that was the first infusion, really, of I think. Of Afro Americans into the military in any sizable number, and rise up in ranks. And I think Colin
Powell was also
my Colonel Roscoe Cartwright. He made general, but there's an organization among Black officers, Afro American officers, called the Rock, named after him, where they help each other up the ladder. Right. And there were some great officers that I met, was fortunate to serve with, who were Afro American, and Sergeant Major Smothers, a command sergeant major. So there was So it served to increase a more African American middle class in America. Tiger Woods' dad and some other great families.
And the military made a conscious effort to try to reduce those casualties.
Yes.
And by the end of the war, and I need to make this point, it was down to about 12%, which paralleled the population. But in the earlier stages, it did have a significant, but again, there was a conscious decision to try to reduce.
So this was a trend over time, though.
It was a trend over time.
Given the 1965 scenario,
Exactly.
up and through to, say, the 1970 era,
Right.
These were trends that were going through the military during Vietnam.
Exactly. As well as we know, I break the Grunts book at 1968 because I see the U.S. military before 68 is a very different military than what we see after 68. After Tet, I think it changes dramatically in terms of discipline, in terms of who's in the front lines.
That's when I was there.
The presence of drugs, the racial issues that are much more prevalent post 68 than are before. And so you see that change, but that doesn't demean those that served post 1968. Many served bravely. And I talk about this in the book. I do point out that atrocities occurred, and they did it at a very high rate in many different areas, depending on leadership. But I also point out the bravery. Over 240 U.S. military people received the Medal of Honor during Vietnam, only surpassed by World War II.
Well, as a person who flew support, artillery support, and FAC support. Everything was dedicated. I mean, the guys on the ground were our heroes. That's all we thought about was them, and thanking God that we were not them. Right on the deck, I was so lucked out. But boy, as much as they got drafted and as much as the system worked against them, they fought well, and they fought well for 10 years. I mean, we fought that war every year for 10 years, right? And so every group had to step up and search and destroy, and out in the woods. I mean, what a burden we placed upon
Well,
them.
they did what the military was supposed to do, and that was the mission they were given. That was to fight and be victorious in battle, which they did.
Right.
But then you've got the other side of these wars that go beyond the battles.
So
and I think I just read a great book review this morning on a new book on Westmoreland's strategy. And that was one of the issues that was raised. They did what they were asked to do. Now, the leadership is the one that you can call in question, including, many say a lot of times that LBJ, if he just let them loose and cross the 17th parallel, and that they'd gone all the way up and bombed Haiphong and, taken them out, that the war would have been changed. So you have all these different viewpoints. I think there's that my question always in that case is, if you can't occupy the South with 550,000 Americans, how many is it going to take to occupy the North in addition, as well as do you really want to go to the Chinese border? We found out in Korea that really was not something.
Maybe not the correct strategy.
And that was Johnson again. How do you maintain this war? How do you maintain in the argument made by John Kennedy, I think was still a valid argument, is we can't win it. The only people who could win it would be the South Vietnamese.
And they were so corrupt to get out of their own way, right?
Well, that depended too on the, what groups you looked at.
Sure.
The ARVN, many people served quite bravely.
Yes.
But they also faced the issues of leadership, corruption in the system, fighting a very.
And they weren't going home after a year.
They weren't going home.
They were going to be on their. They were going to come home carrying their shields, and
many of them have been fighting since 1950. Well, some even as far back as 1946.
I had a couple of veterans from Dien Bien Phu working for me.
Well, a friend of mine shot a guy, and they turned him over, and he was he had fought the French.
Right. That's what I mean. That was not uncommon.
He had a medal. He had a medal from that time when they fought the French. Listen, we're going to get into 1967, and by that time, there's knowledge inside the White House and inside the intelligence community. We're not going to win this thing, right? And so, just tell us about Johnson's trying to sue for peace here.
Well, what happens is, I think Johnson, to a degree, has been misled by some within especially the military, and the one that actually had the best read on it, if you read their documents, the CIA understood it from the beginning, the challenges that were going to, and if you look at their documents, the CIA actually did their job quite well.
Well, they had people there for, like you said, from day one and beyond.
Yeah. And so, but, Johnson by 68, and, the famous March 31st speech, he has reached the conclusion this can't be won. And I think Tet is what really puts the sort of cap.
Well, he lost Walter Cronkite.
Well, he lost, Cronkite. He loses Middle America. And with Tet, it becomes fairly apparent. And then, Nixon runs on a campaign of we're going to win peace with honor, but peace, not victory. And he changes the whole dynamic. And so we see that occur. And Tet is a shock to the Americans. Right. Westmoreland had just been in December of 1968 or 67 in D.C. saying, victory, we're not losing. Where we were losing maybe a year ago, we're winning now. And so it created an expectation. And Johnson is just as guilty. And so when Tet breaks out and everybody's going, what the heck is going on? This is Walter Cronkite's, response. And then he goes and visits Vietnam and comes back and he's totally.
Well, the reporting in the New York Times and then the reporting on that war was excellent. They were telling us what was happening, and people, and there was a big conflict between the administration and the free press.
Well, and we also come to the conclusion that Pentagon papers are released. And, once that, they had been saying these things for a long time, but they had to admit to them and own up to them. So we see in 68, by this time, the United States has decided we got to withdraw with peace.
So Nixon's going to run for office. Tell us about the treason here.
Yes. Well, it's treason in different people's definition.
Okay.
I'm going to, I try to be the objective historian in this case. Nixon's involvement in undermining the peace negotiations that Johnson established with the March 31st, 1968 speech, where he said, we're going to call a bombing halt and we're going to try to push for peace. And we're going to try to do it within a year so that we can withdraw, create a stable enough South Vietnamese government that we can withdraw, and then we're going to wash our hands to a large degree of it. Unfortunately, the Nixon people understand that if that happens, there's a high probability that Hubert Humphrey's going to win. They're looking at the numbers. Yeah, because I mean, ultimately Humphrey only loses by about 600,000 votes.
Mhm.
I think most people forget that. They only look at the 72 landslide vote. But in you got George Wallace pulling a lot of people out, as a third party.
Was Ross Perot in there somewhere?
No, he
was
wasn't.
later.
So George Wallace is running on a independent party.
Oh yeah.
And so he's pulling like 13% of the vote. Many of them Southern whites who would have probably voted for Nixon. So what Nixon does is he uses Claire Chennault's, Madame Chennault, the former Chennault, the former head of the Flying Tigers,
Right.
uses his wife to go to the leader of the South Vietnamese, and say, you need to stop this. I'll get you a better deal. So
here we have Johnson trying to end the war,
Mhm.
and he has sent emissaries over, right, to
We're
get
working through the Polish government, a number of groups.
and he's trying to get a peace accord between the North and the South. And by this time, the casualty rate, I think, is probably 25 or 30,000 Americans killed.
Mhm.
He's trying to end the war, and Nixon finds out about it. And then he sends Madame Chennault over to speak to the South Vietnamese premier at the time, to say, don't sign this. You'll
Right.
get a better deal
Right.
when Nixon is in power.
Exactly.
And so Nixon needed the war to go on in order for him to then say he was going to find a way to end it and beat Humphrey. So this whole thing about the White House and the race to the White House preempted anything about American troops. What about, we were the ones that was the
Right.
kids who were getting drafted. It was the middle class. It was the African Americans. It was these kids out humping the boondocks, getting killed in places like Quezon and the Central Highlands and all the places, but no one seemed to give a damn about those kids.
Yeah.
When do the troops count? Because these guys are making calculations about bigger things and loftier goals like winning the White House.
Right.
And the last thing people think about are the troops. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have this radio show, is to bring these stories to light, that we thought Vietnam would be the last of it. And by gosh, we've made the same mistakes again for the same reasons again. So many people, there's more people being killed by faulty domestic issues and mistakes and egos than there are about, international threats, it would
Right.
seem to me.
Well, and that's the argument, because I mean, one of the fundamental complaints is, we went to war in South Vietnam over the domino theory.
Right.
Where'd the dominoes fall?
Right.
And that's an argument that is given by some. They did fall in Laos and Cambodia, mainly because of destabilization coming out of the war in Vietnam.
Well, we bombed the heck out of them and caused it to happen.
Well, and I won't say we were not exclusively. The North Vietnamese did a great deal on their own,
Sure.
using the Ho Chi Minh Trail
Yeah.
and retreating into Cambodia. And Sihanouk had his own responsibilities for this, as well as Lon Nol and others that were Cambodian leaders. But what I would make a point, I think your point is well made. Politicians have used troops time and time again for political purposes over the years. And so we've seen that play out. It's just the reality of it, but it doesn't make it any better. And so, the Johnson people debated whether to release this information because they actually uncovered it. What they were afraid of, though, is they would have to give up their informants and how they obtained it, which was through some illegal activities of their own, through wiretaps and eavesdropping, and the FBI doing their own. So there was some challenges on why Johnson didn't release this information before the election.
And it just was released like a year ago, wasn't
Well,
it?
it was always out there, and it was always pretty much known, but it's become much more available in terms of the documentary evidence that we have now.
So you've got a smoking gun out there.
Yes, the smoking gun was released in the last couple of years.
And so we're in the same trap again about administration goes into Iraq and they ginned up all the reasons, and we'll get back into that in a minute. We're going to take a short break. You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour, and we're more than pleased to have Dr. Kyle Longley with us today. We'll be right back.
Everyone's going to need an attorney at some point in their life. I'm no different. Hey everyone, it's James from Vets On. Whether it was my last will and testament before deployment or my ongoing custody battle for my children during my divorce, I needed help, so I lawyered up. If you need help, I urge you to contact Capstrom Law Firm. Capstrom Law Firm in Springfield, Missouri services clients throughout the state in criminal law, personal injury, and family law. With over 13 years practicing law, Tom Capstrom understands both law and court procedures and how stressful they can be. Let Tom Capstrom Law Firm and his dedicated staff take the stress and worry out of a difficult situation by calling him today. We feel so strong about the work that Tom and his staff are doing that he'll be a monthly guest on the show. Tom is a veteran and a listener, for God's sake, so you know the guy is solid and will fight for you. Give Tom a call today by calling 417-864-0552 or email Tom at capstromlaw.com. And don't forget to tell him that Vets On sent you.
The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertising.
Breaker, 19. How about that bandit? You got them ears on, son?
Have you ever wanted to be a truck driver? If so, pay attention. If not, pay attention anyway. Southwest Truck Driver Training offers everything you need to get started. You can get hired before you begin training. They've got GI Bill approved training facilities, day, night, or weekend programs to fit your busy schedule. And if you have any questions, no sweat. They've got veteran supportive campuses with veterans on staff to serve you. And on top of that, they have lifetime job placement assistance. Put the pedal to the metal. Call Southwest Truck Driver Training today.
If you or someone you know is looking for a new job or career, you need to visit the pros. National Career Fairs at ncfairs.com. National Career Fairs hosts over 300 career fairs a year nationwide. The events are free and give you the perfect chance to meet some of the top employers in your area face-to-face. To find the nearest career fair to you, visit ncfairs.com. Again, that's ncfairs.com. What are you waiting for?
Would you like to own a thriving business and help employ local veterans? The Vetraplex Handyman Construction and Landscape business is the opportunity you've been waiting for. The Vetraplex is your gateway to an affordable startup business with 0% financing for qualifying owners. By owning a Vetraplex franchise, you will be hiring veterans, providing them both income and opportunity, while at the same time providing your customers a way to say, thank you for your service to our nation's veterans. For more information, visit vetraplex.org. Again, that's vetraplex.org or call 928-284-2022.
You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour on the Vets On Media Network.
We're back. This is the Veterans Heritage Hour with Professor Longley and my pal David Lucer. 1967. While all this machinations in U.S. politics is going on and people are trying to sabotage presidential campaigns, etc. Taxi cab pulls up to my house, 10 Easton Drive in Saratoga County, New York. And it's a taxi cab with a telegram saying that my brother was wounded. We didn't know that at the time because when the taxi cab comes up, telegram, my mother answered the door and collapsed and shrieked. And
A taxi cab.
delivering a telegram. So this is what all the politicians are doing this work in, for greater glory. People like my family, and I was home from Indiantown Gap, ROTC, summer camp. My family got the news that their oldest son was wounded badly and medevac to Brook Hospital and, was going to be, under critical care for a while. But they also had to then send me 2 years later. And that really took our family apart. So that was typical of what was happening to people in the military. And you wrote a wonderful story about the Morenci Marines and what happened to a really, really small community. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, one point I'd make on the post-Tet era, more Americans die after Tet than they died before.
After Nixon sabotages the peace, more people died because of that than.
Well, and that's not, I try to, again, be objective and see, there were many levels to this playing out, but more U.S. soldiers die after Tet than die before. So I think that's something important to keep in mind. As we're waging a war for peace, more Americans die.
And just to reiterate or make sure everybody knows the time frame here, Tet was end of January 1st to February 1968.
Right.
So we were a long ways away still yet to the end of the war, to 1973.
Right. Well, and what I do is I take this wonderful story of a group of 9 Marines from Morenci, Arizona. And it's a small copper mining camp out in southeastern Arizona. And so they joined the Marine Corps together July 4th, 1966. They all go to boot camp together and stay together as a group. And then all eventually end up in Vietnam, where 6 out of the 9 die in combat.
Yeah.
So, I tell stories there, and I think David's read, both of you have read
Yes, and
this.
we met the families.
Yeah,
We
and
were
you
at your
met the
book signing.
families, and you recognize, it was worse than having a taxi cab is when the officer showed up.
From the Marines, they had an officer.
Yeah, they had an officer, and typically what they would do is they stop when they got to town and find the clergyman for that particular denomination, and then accompany over to the family's house. And in the case of a number of the families, they knew what was happening. They saw him pull up to the door. In one of the mothers, she'd already had a dream that her son had been killed. And 2 or 3 days later, the Marines show up when she's working in the high school cafeteria. She lets out a loud shriek. She knows
shriek.
Exactly what has happened. She can remember that shriek even today.
I can remember my mother's as well.
Yeah.
It was something.
It was just a horrible situation.
Yeah.
And so, we see this happening, especially post-Tet. Most of the young men in this group die post-Tet. And, it's just a town of 5,000 to lose 6 young men. And the others died. But from one group, it's a 66% kill rate. When the odds are, and, we've studied this in Vietnam, it was about a 7 to 8% chance of a serviceman being killed. So they've got a 66% death rate. So, it's a fascinating story of why they joined, and it looks at issues. They're fighting, most of them are fighting in Vietnam when their parents have been locked out by the company. And a lot of anti-war protesters are asking them.
In the mining town of
in the
Morenci.
mining town. They've been locked out by Phelps Dodge, and so they're having to send their combat pay home to their moms and dads to survive the strike or the lockout. So, a lot of the anti-war protesters, why are you fighting for a system that typically favors the company over? And, those company people aren't sending their sons to Vietnam.
Sure.
And so there were a lot of questions raised. But these were very patriotic young men. They volunteered. They chose the Marine Corps purposely because they wanted a chance to prove themselves. And so I tell their story. I tell not only their story, but the family stories, because this is one that affects millions and millions of people. 2.3 million people serve in the Vietnam War theater. You take and multiply that by family members, and you've reached a large portion of the American society. And I think that's, in Grunts, I've got a great story there of Peg Mullen, whose son was killed by friendly fire. And how that turned her into someone that questioned the war. So you've got so many people starting to question, why are they fighting? And some in Morenci are saying, why are we not winning? That's what we should be doing. Not just that they're questioning the war. They're saying, if we're going to fight this war, we fight it to win. And if we can't fight it to win, then we get out.
Sure.
So you've got the variety of people coming at it from a variety of different ways, but a general sadness that is created by the family, for the families. And, the sadness for the 3 young men that survived and came home with the survivor's guilt and PTSD that they carried throughout most of their lives. Only one's still alive. And so it was a significant struggle. And what I did with Grunts is it's the macro story. It's covering people from Washington to Maine to Florida to California.
That's the American story.
It's the American story. It's the big story.
Yeah, the one of the comments you had is that the Morenci Marines were wanting to go to the Legion Hall. If they got to be veterans, they would be members of the Legion Hall.
Exactly.
And that would be their deal. And then if you get up to another level, you see the president, the VFW, you're going to be a warrior in your own community and join these elite organizations.
Exactly.
Right? And here's Nixon and those guys plotting and scheming to win the White House.
Right.
And these poor guys are slugging it out in the jungles and paying the price so they could belong to the Legion.
Yeah. Well, it's that and but the respect they would receive within the community. Yes. And I think there's a point I would make that the Morenci story, and I've had letters from all over the country. I just got one from New Jersey, and it was a veteran saying, "This was my life. You could have written this in my little town in New Jersey." I've had them from West Texas. I've had them from all over the country. These are small town people. And I was raised in a small town myself in the oil patch of West Texas. So,
and a football player.
And a football player and a football coach's son. We had all kinds of levels.
A football coach who coached for 43 years.
Yes. So, and a veteran himself.
Yes.
And so, this story resonates with people. And again, I think a lot of these young men that fought on the front lines of Vietnam were the sons of farmers. They were the sons of miners. They came from Pennsylvania. They came from West Virginia. You look at the casualty rates of places like Bardstown, Kentucky, Bellsville, Ohio. My favorite one that I always use in my examples, War, West Virginia. This came small suburbs. You read Ron Kovic's story of what his opportunities were and how, in the same case of Kovic talks about the Marine recruiter coming in and marching down to the Marine recruiter did it to these young men.
And they felt to impress their girlfriends.
It was that, and be able to, they had a choice. They could go work in the mines, which was not easy work, or they could seek some, adventure and other places in the world. But unfortunately, in the case of these 9, they paid a horrible price, as well as their families.
So it seems David wanted to make a comparison between then and now, but it seems like the people who are joining, this is an all-volunteer army now, but they're joining from these smaller communities in areas where there might not be as many opportunities or to get an education. And you want to touch on that, David?
Sure. And one of the things that kind of touched me throughout this was historically, we're always looking at what happened in the past and how we can apply those lessons, to the immediate future or the immediate present or the not so distant future. Tell us a little bit about your perspective on that.
Well, I'll give you a prime example. If the conclusion of grunts, or actually the epilogue, if you remember, I talk about Mountain View High School in Tucson, who had lost 6 people at this point, the first publication in 2008, including a young woman who had been a baton twirler in the band. So you got Mountain View High School overly represented in terms of the numbers that were lost. And so I think there's a lot of continuities here. In 2003, I started to see a lot of my students being pulled out. A lot of them had joined the National Guard pre-2001, pre-September 11, and suddenly they were being activated. And I was they'd come in and say, Dr. Longley, I've got my notice. I've got to leave. I'm going to be dropping your class. This is the reason I'm heading for National Guard service. And on a couple of occasions, they'd say, we did not anticipate this. This is not why we signed up for the Guard. We signed up to go to school, get some benefits, work a few weekends. And suddenly now they're, with limited training, being sent to places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think there are a lot of continuities and why they join. I mean, I talk a lot about this in terms of young men join because this is what you're supposed to do as a man. I don't think that's really changed to a large degree. Watching American Sniper and Chris Kyle being from my home area of Odessa, Texas, and being raised in that area, I can see the mentality. It's very apparent to me how this is a continuity that's running through. What has changed now is there's people like yourself, David, that served as contractors that went back. There's young women involved in the process now. There are differences, but there are a lot of similarities.
Sure.
And one book I would recommend, if for people wanting to see some of the continuities here, there's a wonderful book that just came out by Kochi, and it's called The Invisible Front. And it's about a family who lost 2 sons, one to suicide before he went into the military because he was afraid. He had depression and he was afraid of being tested and then finding the drugs and being kicked out of the military. Their father was an Army general. And the other, so he commits suicide because he gets off his medications. The other joins the Army, and 3 months later, after his brother commits suicide, he's blown up by IED in Iraq. And it talks about the father's struggle to try to get representation for young men and to deal with, because he was put in command of Fort Carson.
Sure.
And dealing with the issue of suicides and PTSD and the struggles that he endured. And I recommend that highly, but you see the continuities there. The survivor's guilt, the father saying, and the mother saying to the father, basically, if you hadn't been a military, if you hadn't pushed this on them, they wouldn't be dead right now.
And what about we've only got a couple more minutes left here, but what does it say about our future?
Well, it says about the future is we forget the past too quickly. I think that's what it says. I mean, I think, as you were noting earlier on your study, of having your brainwaves, we're talking 40 years later. These issues are still resonating.
Sure.
I read a great story yesterday. I talked about that a guy just retired. And once he retired, because he had so much time on his hand, the PTSD had actually kicked in, a Vietnam veteran. So we're living with these issues 40 years later. We're going to be living with the issues that come out of Iraq, Afghanistan 40 years later.
Sure.
The politicians don't want to have to deal with that because it costs money now to have to treat the issues that are coming out of this. But it is still extremely important. So the continuities are the same.
So we need investment in veterans more now than ever.
I agree. And I think we need more study. I mean, the greatest review that I've received for grunts is the book was called A Monument to the Vietnam Veteran.
Wow.
in Army Times of a monument to the Vietnam veteran.
Well,
To me,
it's-
that's high praise.
Well, we
And it is. And
David
it should
and
be.
I think all that's been said about the Vietnam veterans, I was damn proud to serve with them. We bled for each other. We were there for each other. We had each other's back. We respected each other. And if anybody was a precious commodity in Vietnam, it was the grunts. We were all there to support them. And boy, they did a superb job. Our next week's show is we're going to have a wonderful man and a leader of men, a leader of those grunts. Jim Kelsey did 2 tours in Vietnam, did a tour with the 10th Special Forces Group, and he's got some great tales and stories. He's a wonderful teacher and a wonderful man. But he got involved with military intelligence, and he was running agents into the former Soviet Union. So he was there also to set up Delta Force. So stay tuned for next week. We'll be bringing Jim Kelsey to you, and he will then tell some great stories about the types of men that Professor Longley was just talking about, grunts. This man led them twice and has a great deal of respect and reverence for the people he led and for the service they did for their country.
Just want to say thank you very much, Dr. Kyle Longley.
Thank you.
Author,
Thank you for the
professor, historian, West Texas football player. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and we'll be back. Thanks for tuning into the Veterans Heritage Hour. We're also on a podcast, so if you teachers out there want to download this, feel free. We are making this as educational as we possibly can, and we want to thank Arizona State University for allowing us to have access to people like Professor Longley and the people involved with the Center for the Study of Warfare. So thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
The bomb's busting